good evening and welcome to the League of Women Voters Presents. I'm Jim Robertson, and our topic tonight is immigration policies and their impact on women. My guest is Becky Martinez. Becky is an assistant professor in women and gender studies at MU. Been here since 2001. And if I'm remembering right, you have particular emphasis in your academic life on Latina and Chicana
Yes.
women's cultures, basically.
Yes, correct.
Can you tell me a little bit about your work in those areas and how you started in Southern California and ended up in Missouri and what you've learned along the way?
Yes, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. I started out as an undergraduate at the University of California, Irvine, and along the way, students were very active regarding issues of diversity and equity, and we were instrumental in helping to hire a Chicano faculty member in the anthropology department who does immigration studies. And at the time, I just didn't know how important this person would be. And one of the reasons why I really feel that students of color benefit from faculty mentors, who have had the same experiences, culturally and socially that they have. And anyway, so I took his class. I was a general social science major, and I was very hesitant about taking the class because it was something called anthropology, and I never heard of that. And I thought, what does this have to do with immigration? Are we digging up bones?
Yeah, right, cavemen.
I didn't know, and I was more familiar with psychology, things like that. My parents, my mother had a 6th grade education in Mexico, and my father just studied up to 7th grade in Los Angeles, and so first generation college student.
Yeah.
And I wasn't the kind of person who had parents who could help me with homework or anything like that, so I did well in school, but I was not as worldly and familiar with things that maybe my peers were. And I took this course, and it changed my life. It was fabulous. He ended up being my mentor and my PhD advisor, and he is a nationally known expert on migration issues, particularly from Mexico to the U.S. Dr. Leo Chavez, I'll give him a plug.
Good.
He has a few books on immigration issues, and so that's kind of where it all started. And that's been my mentorship and my interest, especially with Latina women.
Right. Now, you had some experience in Central America?
My project was in Venezuela,
Okay.
and I have a book coming out on that work. And it became my interest because through my immigration project with Dr. Leo Chavez, he did a study on perceptions of cervical and breast cancer among immigrants to look at ways that we could improve health, because we learned that Latinas had higher rates of cervical cancer than the general population. It's a easily treatable disease if caught early, and women shouldn't be dying from it. And so we were trying to figure out what was going on in terms of maybe there were some cultural perceptions about cervical cancer and breast cancer, and how could we, as anthropologists, and as medical anthropologists in particular, contribute to helping women in this area. So I became interested in the topic of cervical cancer. So then I studied cervical cancer among patient-doctor interactions in Venezuela, because they also have very high rates.
So when is the book coming out?
Hopefully it's in process
Oh,
now,
good.
and editors looking at it, and so fingers crossed for
Good.
soon. Yeah.
Yeah. What is it about the women's experience, immigrant women's experience, that you find interesting, that sets them apart?
Yeah. Well, in the past, we had this image of the single male immigrating to different countries, sort of this kind of rugged man image of immigration. And in fact, for a while, that kind of was the case. And today, something that has changed is that we are likely to see women migrating as much as men, and sometimes even more. We know that 3% of the population does not live in its country of origin, so people are moving, right? And more and more now because different access of transportation and ways to get from one place to another. And for women, there are a number of reasons why they migrate that are both the same and different than why men migrate. And so, for example, you may have women who are primary caretakers of parents, of other family members. They might be primary caretakers of their children, so single mothers. Women might be fleeing domestic violence situations and choose to migrate for those reasons. And women are also very much valued in terms of their work in service industry. And so as nursing home workers, as in-home childcare workers. So anything that is seen to involve caretaking is likely to still be mostly the domain of women. And as we have seen historically, women in the U.S., for example, work outside of the home. We've seen a need for people to do the caretaking jobs because at the same time, we haven't seen men take over those caretaking abilities in the home as, we have some, but still we know that in heterosexual households with two people working 40 hours a week, women still end up doing most of the caretaking, and it's changing.
Right,
but,
slowly.
But it's still that kind of experience. So there are a number of those kind of reasons why women may migrate, and that would be different from why men choose to migrate.
And then what issues then do they encounter in this country as an immigrant?
Yeah, and those again sometimes can be, first, one of the issues is crossing. About 40% of the population that's, for example, undocumented, I'll take that as a point of reference, have overstayed visas, right? And so they didn't necessarily, cross the Mexico-U.S. border.
Right.
Through the desert or anything like that, or through the Rio Grande. But other, people who do that are at risk for sexual assault. And this is something that we do know. We know that it's hard to gauge the numbers because women, in general, if women aren't open about sexual assault in this society, much less are they going to be with Border Patrol agents,
right.
Because they are in a very vulnerable position. Many of the crossings now are in the desert area because we have closed off urban crossings with militarization of the border. We can talk a little bit about that if you'd like. And so now women are crossing in desert areas when they do cross that way that are dangerous because of obviously the environment, but also because of smugglers. And also because of U.S. Border Patrol. There have been a number of cases, and again, we think this is underrepresented, of our Border Patrol agents sexually assaulting women. And the Border Patrol, in fact, notes that it is a higher percentage within the Border Patrol agency than in any other policing institution.
Really?
And one of the reasons we think that is because many times Border Patrol agents are on their own. Right, and women are, either on their own or with, one other person in the desert
right.
crossing. So they're in a very vulnerable situation, and there are no other eyes, on them.
Right.
And so that, that makes them even more susceptible. Once they're here, they can face those kind of issues again, depending upon where they work. Again, it's a vulnerable population. If they need to work and a boss can say, well, you do this, or I'm going to call Border Patrol and they'll come get you. So those are some of the things that they can face. And things that are similar to men too, like wage theft, not getting paid what they are owed.
What about these persistent perceptions that immigrants are coming here to get welfare?
Okay, well, Well, welfare is hard to get even if you are here legally. And of course, with the reforms in the immigration law, even if you come here with legal documents, you are not allowed to apply for welfare kind of programs for 5 years. So that's even if you come here with documentation. And without documentation, you do not qualify for anything except for emergency care. You are supposed to, if you are in an accident and taken to the emergency room, you are supposed to be seen there.
That goes for if you're human.
Yeah, that's
right.
it. Yeah, that's, for everyone. And women who are pregnant may get some assistance for, to make sure that they are getting sustenance and that that child is, doing okay and so forth, getting just nutrition, milk,
Right.
things like that. So, but that's really it.
Why do these stories persist?
I think because they are told and told again. And people tend to want to believe things that already go along with their own stereotypes. So this is a cognitive bias that we have, where we look for things that will just feed into our own beliefs. And now you have the problem of, as we've all heard, the whole fake news thing. And stories will come out about use of services and things like that, and they wouldn't be true. But if you already believe them that they
Sure.
would be true, then it's just going to reinforce your cognitive bias.
You live in your bubble.
Yeah, and we don't base our policies on actually what is going on, what we see empirically, but sometimes our policies are based on what politicians perceive will get them reelected. And if fear is one of those things, then they will go for that. And we have been conditioned to be fearful of immigrants throughout our history. Our history of immigration is based, in fact, on racism, even sexism, classism. So just in spite of what the Statue of Liberty says, our policies have, up until 1963, based, for example, on racial quotas.
Odd that we're a nation of immigrants with that kind of system.
Yeah, and we tend to kind of bring in programs when we need workers, and this is
Yeah.
something that people don't realize. And then when we don't need them, we deport them. And so we actually, if you look at sort of economic recessions and depression, you'll see that anti-immigrant sentiments are highest at those moments, right? And for example, the 1930s repatriation, which a lot of people don't know about. You ask somebody, have you heard of Japanese internment? And they say yes. But if you ask them if they've heard about the fact that between 500,000 and 1 million Mexican Americans, U.S. citizens like myself, Mexican American, were repatriated, and I use that in quotes because repatriation means being sent back to the country in which you were born. But this was people who were born in the U.S. who were sent to Mexico during the Depression based on racism, and that those jobs should be available for white people and for non-Latino people, not for Latino people. Yeah.
You mentioned the militarization of the border. What's going on in the border right now?
Gosh. Well, of course, we have the idea with President Trump starting his campaign for president, right, with his announcement that criminals and rapists were coming over into the U.S. And that we needed the wall to stop them. Well, that is your prime example of a fear tactic. And his whole program was based on building the wall, right? And the chance of the crowds build the wall. And so if we look empirically at what that would mean, it's not a very viable solution. And in fact, this is something that environmentalists are concerned about because we know that the wall would have to go through areas that disrupt migration patterns for animals. that disrupt a very important nature reserve for birds, that would go through tribal areas, Native Americans, and that wouldn't be very effective. You know, we're talking about estimates around $20 billion for this thing. Because, you know, people will find ways to cross if they need to cross. And most importantly, since 2008, migration from Mexico in particular has been at net zero. In other words, as many people who've crossed the border have gone back to Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually don't have a border crossing problem, you know, since and in fact, people are saying, experts are saying that it may even be at, you know, negative, you know, that more people are going back.
Now, is that a function of economics?
The economy is improving in Mexico, and that's one of the big things. And people tend to be rational about their choices. You know, one of the myths is that people want to come here, as you said, to use welfare programs. Well, the truth is that people actually want to stay in their countries of origin.
Sure.
And there are push factors that, you know, make them leave their countries when they would rather stay. You know, and when they get here, they find all kinds of obstacles, and for many of them, it can be very difficult. So, you know, previous to the militarization of the border, there used to be what was called cyclical migration. So people would go back and forth. You know, they would just go back and forth. And Douglas Massey, who's a sociologist and demographer, expert on immigration, estimates that 80% of the population would go back, right? People wouldn't stay here. Well, with the militarization of the border, they don't do that anymore, because crossing the border has gone from costing $300 for a smuggler to help you cross to $3,000 to $5,000 now. And now you're risking your life in the desert, as before where you were crossing in urban areas. You weren't doing that. And so one of the unintended consequences of that is now that people are settling in the U.S., right? With these harsh immigration laws, you don't have the cyclical migration. You've
Right.
put a monkey in the wrench. You've screwed something up that actually was working for both nations, right? And this
Right.
is if we focus specifically on Mexico and the U.S., which is kind of what we think about with immigration. We do have about 53% of migrants coming from Mexico because of proximity. One reason. Corporations also have recruited workers from Mexico into the U.S., and people don't know that portion of it either. They think that people just come one day, they decide, they gather a knapsack, and they cross. Whereas, people take years to make these decisions, and they usually have social networks in the U.S. to help them out. They maybe have to take out loans with family members to save up for the crossing, and then there's no guarantee because you could be caught and sent back, or you can die.
Right.
So it's not an easy thing anymore.
Are they
to get up and go.
finding these jobs mainly in ag kind of situations, like the poultry plants and those factory farm?
Yeah, so locally we know the poultry plants in Sedalia
Yeah.
and around the area, Tyson. One thing that immigrants have done actually with the Midwest in particular is revived communities. Immigrants, whether they're undocumented or documented, are some of the portions of our population that are the greatest entrepreneurs. And they set up businesses, restaurants, stores, ways for that they can sell things that will help next immigrants, acculturate to the area, things that they miss from home. And they have revived towns in the Midwest that were just dead, right? And you have the economy spurred again where it wasn't. And so these are the things that often get left out of these images of immigrants in the U.S. that I think are really important to tell.
I think a scene that really stayed with me was, I think, in Iowa or Nebraska. There were these big pig farms or chicken farms, factory farm kind of things, and INS or ICE made a sweep and took all their employees, basically.
Yeah.
Now, what is that all about? Is that just a periodic showing?
You know, sometimes I think, and I think maybe somebody messed up too, or somebody was trying to make a political statement about their being tough on immigration, and maybe they were, and I don't mean that cynically.
Yeah.
I really mean that, you know, back in the day, it was funny because when I was first studying immigration, the governor of California at the time, who was it? Pete Wilson. Was found to have had a lot of his business friends writing to him and telling him, you better not do raids. Like, you know that is not good for our business, so you need to cut out this nonsense that you're doing. And he was trying to make political points, right? And myself, I was in Jackson Hole in the 90s, and my partner and I, my husband now, were hiking, backpacking. We loved to backpack. So we were in Jackson Hole, and it was a ghost town. And there, you know, the restaurants were full, but nobody was around, no waiters. There was long waits. We were like, what's going on here? Well, it turns out that there had been a raid the day before, and people who were citizens were also rounded up if they happened to not have documentation, the city was in chaos. They
Yeah.
had, what were they going to do with the tourists? You know,
Yeah,
people
no
to make
service
the
workers.
beds, no
Yeah.
service workers, and what made it look twice as bad was they took all of their shoes, and to keep track of them, they wrote numbers on their arms. And
Oh
I
my
just thought,
gosh. They
you
call that
know,
optics
the
now. you know.
optics of
Yeah.
that were just, yeah, not
Stunning.
good. Yeah, and so those things happen, and it's actually business people who can be outwardly sometimes conservative and supportive,
Yeah.
but when it comes to their businesses,
Right.
it's like, don't mess with it. And of course, with the agricultural workers that you mentioned, our laws have also favored them. So whenever there has been, like even the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, there were special provisions written in for agricultural workers so that their workers, they had lobbies, and they got some things in the law that would protect their bringing in agricultural workers. So, you know, there's definitely an economic component that gets kind of hidden under these sort of myths about immigration.
You know, the Obama administration made a run at immigration reform. And then we had the Gang of Eight in the Senate, and it looked like something might happen, but then it fell apart. This administration doesn't seem to be paying any, beyond the wall, doesn't
Yeah.
seem to be talking about immigration at all.
No.
Why is it so hard when it's plain that the law's a mess, the laws are a mess? Why is it so hard to get something credible going?
I think it really is that there is such division now, and people do not work with each other. And even though it's a small segment of politicians, the Tea Party, for example, has had a strong component and voice. And they are not really interested in immigration reform other than the wall
Building the wall.
and self-deport, right? Make it so terrible for people that they will leave. And what that means is laws that outwardly discriminate, you know, give me your papers kind of laws. And recently, now we see that just passed in Texas. And so if you look like you could be undocumented, you're supposed to be stopped for other things. But in reality, if you look, which means if you are brown,
Right.
basically, then you can be harassed. And there's research actually showing that those are grave issues in border towns, that because the border has become so militarized, there are Border Patrol and local police who are constantly stopping citizens and residents of the towns. And there has been some interesting research on the psychological and emotional effects of that kind of constant vigilance and monitoring, and what people go through when they are just constantly stopped. And you know, it's just like stop and frisk in New York. And
Right.
a lot of people, you know, made light of that, but there are real consequences to that
Yeah.
for people. And even if they feel then like something goes wrong or they have to call the police, they might not trust the police anymore. And
Well, guess what? We're out of time.
wow.
This is, you know, we could talk about this for a long time. It's an interesting and important topic, and thank you for coming here and shining some light on it.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Becky Martinez, and I'm Jim Robertson. Until next time, good night.